Now, the rest of the story. Is a revolution all blood and guts and guns? Or is there room for the artist, the author, the poet, the performer, the composer? At the time of our American Revolution, a gentleman named Francis Hopkinson was all of those things. He'd studied in England under painter Benjamin West, became proficient at portraits and engraving. His poetry, both humorous and serious, was widely published. A talented musician, Friend Hopkinson gave harpsichord performances. He composed. In fact, his was the first book of music published by an American composer. Well, let's see what else. He served as chairman of the Continental Navy Board between 1776 and 1778. For 3 years afterward, he held the office of Treasurer of Loans. His creative contribution to the cause of freedom included revolutionary essays, terribly effective. You know, only once did he regret having used his creativity to benefit the nation. And here's why. In 1780, Hopkinson wrote a letter to the Board of Admiralty reminding them of a particular service that he had performed as chairman, and considering it had been beyond the responsibilities of his position, he now asked that he be reimbursed. He wanted to be paid for it. For the Board of Admiralty referred Hopkinson's letter to Congress. Congress passed it along to the Board of the Treasury. Next thing you know, Hopkinson was being asked for more details in the form of a specific bill. All right, said Friend, so he produced a second document, forwarded that to James Milligan, the Auditor General, who sent it to the commissioners on the Chamber of Accounts. You're keeping track of this, I hope. He returned it to the Auditor General with advice for payment, and he returned it to the Board of Treasury with his endorsement. And the Board of Treasury? No, as a matter of fact, they objected on the grounds that no vouchers had been included with the bill and demanded a new one be submitted. And now all that you've just heard was only the beginning, and all Friend wanted, a signer of our Declaration of Independence. All he wanted was to be paid for what he considered a significant service. Where, after all, did it get him? Get him a congressional investigation. And that turmoil continued for more than a year. There were summonses and reports and tentative conclusions, and there were reevaluations and more reports and another investigation and resignations and resolutions and more reports. And after all that was said and done, three things were apparent. Friend had indeed rendered the service he had claimed. Friend had enemies on the Board of the Treasury. Where did that leave him? Here is where. Friend Hopkinson was never, ever going to be paid. You see, according to the board, the public was entitled to additional services now and then from government employees who already drew comfortable salaries. And just maybe, if Francis Hopkinson had been reimbursed for what he did, maybe we would have forgotten him. But as it happened, a seamstress named Betsy Ross absolutely, unjustifiably received credit for the accomplishment of artist Francis Hopkinson, which was the design of the American flag. And now you know the rest of the story.
And now, the rest of the story. Francis Hopkinson is not a name that most of us immediately recognize, but we've all heard how Betsy Ross, that bonnet-wearing grandmotherly figure, designed the American flag. But according to Mr. Harvey's broadcast, this is not the case. Betsy Ross was born Elizabeth Griscom in January 1752, and Betsy is short for Elizabeth. While Betsy was apprenticed as an upholsterer in Philadelphia, she met John Ross, also an upholsterer and nephew of George Ross, Jr., the signer of the Declaration of Independence. In 1773, Betsy and John married. Soon thereafter, Betsy and John started their own upholstery business. According to the family's oral history, Betsy and John joined Christ Church, the same church George Washington attended when in Philadelphia. 2 years after their marriage, on April 19, 1775, the American Revolutionary War began with the battles of Lexington and Concord. John Ross was a member of the local Pennsylvania provincial militia. Now, he died in 1775 or early 1776. According to one legend, John was guarding a store of gunpowder when it exploded and took his life. Betsy, now a widow, continued the upholstery business as well as helping with the war effort. She repaired uniforms, made tents and blankets, and made other items needed by the soldiers. The popular story is that one day in late spring 1776, General George Washington, along with Robert Morris and George Ross, now I mentioned George Ross earlier, both of whom were members of a congressional committee, visited Betsy Ross and commissioned her to create the U.S. flag. She purportedly changed the design of the flag from having 6 pointed stars to having 5 pointed stars because they were quicker and easier to cut out and attach. Now, it certainly is a good story that we've all come to know, but is the story based in fact? The Betsy Ross story became popular as the centennial of the United States drew near. In March 1870, William J. Canby, Betsy Ross's grandson by her third husband, John Claypool, claimed in a research paper presented to the Historical Society of Pennsylvania that his grandmother had made with her hands the first flag of the United States. In his presentation, William said, "The flag was soon finished, and Betsy returned it, the first star-spangled banner that ever floated upon the breeze, to her employer, George Ross. It was run up to the peak of one of the ships lying at the wharf and received the unanimous approval of the committee and of a little group of bystanders looking on, and the same way was carried into the State House and laid before Congress with a report from the committee. The next day, Colonel Ross called upon Betsy and informed her that her work had been approved and her flag adopted, and he now requested her to turn her whole attention to the manufacture of flags." Now, I'll leave a link in the description so you can read the complete transcription of William Canby's presentation. The legend of Betsy Ross and the creation of the flag remained unknown to most Americans until the centennial in 1876. From then, the legend was spread until it became accepted as fact by most Americans. On January 1st, 1952, on what would have been Betsy Ross's 200th birthday, the U.S. Postal Service issued a 3-cent stamp which showed George Washington, Robert Morris, George Ross, who commissioned the flag, along with Betsy Ross displaying the flag. Immediately, the post office department was flooded with letters from stamp collectors and historians who agreed that there was no authentic information to suggest that Betsy Ross had any role in designing the flag. The post office department disagreed, claiming it had research and backing from the Library of Congress. We know for certain that Betsy Ross created flags for the Pennsylvania militia and the Continental Army during the Revolution, but no primary source documentation, nothing at all from that period, shows that Betsy Ross had any part in the designing of the flag. William Canby made his claim about his grandmother in 1870, nearly a century after the event was supposed to have taken place. Now, documents and receipts held at Mount Vernon, home of George Washington, show that in 1774, John and Betsy Ross made bed hangings for George Washington. This just shows that General Washington was familiar with Betsy and the quality of her work. Betsy continued to make flags for over 50 years, many of which were made through government contracts. Several other upholsterers in Philadelphia also made American flags for the military. Pretty much anyone in Philadelphia who had the necessary talent and skill made flags. So what about this largely forgotten character, Francis Hopkinson? On June the 14th, 1777, the Second Continental Congress passed the Flag Act of 1777, which described the specifics to be used in the creation of the official flag of the United States. The passage of the Flag Act of 1777 is the reason we celebrate Flag Day on June the 14th. The Flag Act of 1717 was short, just 31 words long. Resolved that the flag of the 13 United States be 13 stripes, alternate red and white, that the Union be 13 stars, white in a blue field, representing a new constellation. Man, I mean, that's pretty vague. The resolution was created by the Continental Marine Committee, of which Francis Hopkinson was a member. Directly under the Continental Marines Committee was the Navy Board, of which Francis Hopkinson was the chairman. According to the journals of the Continental Congress, it was Francis Hopkinson who designed the American flag. By that time, he had also created the Great Seal of New Jersey and was one of 3 consultants on the design of the Great Seal of the United States. He also designed our continental currency. In May 1780, Francis Hopkinson, now I'm intentionally repeating his name so you'll be more likely to remember it. In May 1780, Francis Hopkinson wrote a letter to the Continental Board of Admiralty asking for a reward for his designing the Board of Admiralty seal, the Treasury Board seal, and the flag of the United States of America. The reward he asked for was not monetary, but a quarter cask of the public wine. Now, a Quaker cask of wine is a reference to a Lefroy quarter cask, a single malt Scotch whiskey that is aged in smaller casks to create a distinctive flavor. This increased contact with the wood gave the Scotch whiskey a distinctive and popular flavor. The Continental Board of Admiralty forwarded his letter to Congress. In June 1780, a month after his first letter, Francis Hopkinson sent a bill for his drawings and devices. This bill did not list his design for the flag of the United States, but the flag for the U.S. Navy, which you'll recognize. Take a look at this. Notice the stripes on the flag. The outer stripes are red. This is a rendition of Francis Hopkinson's design for the Navy flag. Now look at this one with white outer stripes. This was Francis Hopkinson's original design for the American flag. But Congress preferred the Navy flag and adopted it as the official flag of the United States. As we learned from Mr. Harvey, Francis Hopkinson was never paid with whiskey or money for designing the American flag. Unfortunately, we still associate Betsy Ross with the design of the American flag and not Francis Hopkinson. But Francis Hopkinson has one claim to fame that Betsy Ross's family could never claim. He, Francis Hopkinson, was one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence. Maybe now when you see Old Glory waving in the wind, you'll remember the name Francis Hopkinson. I'm Brad Dison. Thanks for watching, and now you know the rest of the story.